Well, the newest snapshot of the 2020 Democratic primary for president is out, and it has South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg in double digits nationally for the very first time. This CNN poll is consistent with others that have shown him surging in early states like Iowa and New Hampshire. Meanwhile, Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders remain in the top tier. For more, I want to bring in Julia Manchester. She's a reporter for The Hill who covers all things 2020. Okay, Julia, so I want to start with Buttigieg. What can we sort of attribute to this momentum and this surge that we've seen in his campaign?
Well, I think Buttigieg has very much tried to sell himself as the alternative centrist to Elizabeth Warren. We've seen that Joe Biden has very much sold himself as a centrist, more establishment candidate. But we saw in the last couple of weeks Pete Buttigieg really attacking Elizabeth Warren's Medicare for All plan and touting his own Medicare for All Who Want It plan. So this is essentially him trying to pitch himself as an alternative to Elizabeth Warren, who for a while was climbing in the polls and in many state polls was considered the frontrunner. Pete Buttigieg is also very popular in Iowa because he is a Midwestern mayor. He's known in that region, and his campaign simply has a very good infrastructure in Iowa as well as New Hampshire. However, in South Carolina, it's a different story. We're seeing him doing so well the national polling and in the early state polling in Iowa and New Hampshire, but in South Carolina, he's continuing to kind of be in those single-digit numbers, and I think a lot of that's attributable to his struggle with the African-American community there.
You know, when you look at Elizabeth Warren, is her campaign concerned that nationally she's dipped 4 points since last month?
Well, it's interesting. Elizabeth Warren told reporters in Iowa last night that she doesn't pay attention to the polls, that she's essentially out there still campaigning, trying to connect with working families. However, I would absolutely imagine there is a concern because she had this slow uphill climb, a bit of a positive trajectory for her campaign, and now you're seeing Pete Buttigieg really move in on that. So, you know, this four-way race has really turned into these two centrist, more establishment candidates, Biden and Buttigieg, against Warren and Sanders, the more progressive candidates, and it'll be interesting to see how they, you know, continue to differentiate themselves. Last week during the debate in Atlanta, we did not see many of the candidates, including Warren, pull punches at Pete Buttigieg, and we were kind of expecting him to be really the targeted candidate. However, I would imagine in December, with Pete Buttigieg really starting to intrude on Warren and Biden's ground in these early states, he will become very much a target on the debate stage.
You know, Julia, when it comes to Joe Biden, nationally polls have him in the lead, but when you look at states like Iowa, it's far more competitive. Is he shifting his strategy at all at this point?
You know, I think he's shifting his strategy in that he's simply paying more attention, I think, to Iowa right now, because I think his campaign very much knows that if he does not have the momentum going out of Iowa into New Hampshire and into South Carolina, that could be an issue for him. We know that Biden is very strong in more of the Super Tuesday states, the Nevadas, and in South Carolina, simply because he's very popular with those coalitions down there and has very much relied on the Obama coalition in those areas that include African-American and Latino voters. However, in Iowa and New Hampshire, you see a more white progressive voting base, and that's not necessarily very popular with Biden right now. So he's going to be paying attention, at least going to try to get into the top two, top three in Iowa in order to have that momentum going into South Carolina, where he could perform very strongly.
So New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg spent his first 2 days of his campaign in Virginia and Arizona. He's spending millions of dollars targeting states like Florida and Texas. And on Tuesday, he had to answer some criticism that he's just trying to buy the nomination.
I will be the only candidate in this race who isn't corruptible, who isn't going to take a penny from anyone, and will work for $1 a year.
Julia, do you think that rebuttal will be effective?
I don't think so, because it sounds quite a bit like Donald Trump's campaign slogan or campaign speech in 2016 saying he couldn't be bought. You know, a lot of the progressives in this race, whether it's Warren or Sanders, are already painting him as this out-of-touch billionaire who can't really connect with the average voter. And his strategy is so interesting and will likely tick a lot of voters in Iowa and New Hampshire off, because he's essentially ignoring those voters and going straight into the Super Tuesday states. However, I think at this point, since he's he's really entered the race so late, it's impossible for him to really make headway in those really early states. So he's going to put all of his eggs in the Super Tuesday basket. And we're already seeing that he's spending, $30 million in ads in these states and really pumping out that infrastructure. So this will be a huge political experiment for a primary, in that he's skipping those early states and going right into the later states. And I've talked to a number of New York Democratic strategists who have worked with Bloomberg in the past, and they're saying don't count him out, because he's different from previous candidates, because he already has he has a lot of history with advocating for progressive causes such as gun control and climate change, and he's already popular with a certain sector of the Democratic vote, and he's self-funding his campaign. I mean, he can run as many advertisements as he wants in these states, and I think that poll, even though it's just at 3%, it shows that he does still have a pretty high name recognition going into it.
We had an author of his biography, she wrote a biography about Michael Bloomberg, Eleanor Randolph, and she said the same thing, that he was down 40 points before winning the mayoral race in New York City. But timing has always been on Michael Bloomberg's side in his career, and that you shouldn't rule him out. And we're also in very strange political times, so there isn't an accurate barometer. So it makes politics all the more interesting these days.
Absolutely.
Julia,
Absolutely.
I want to thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.